I'm going to be talking now about manufacturing costs. Now, let me make a point. This is management accounting. You're going to be learning tools and techniques that managers use to help them manage. Now, we're talking managers in all kinds of businesses, service companies, profit businesses, non-profit businesses, managers in government. Every operation has managers. And the tools and techniques that we're going to talk about are designed to help managers. Doesn't matter what kind of industry they're in, what type of company they are, whether they are profit or non-profit, does not matter. They're managers. But throughout this course, we use a manufacturing company to demonstrate the tools and techniques that we're going to use. But don't get the idea that this only is for managers of a manufacturing company. It's not. Now, the reason we're using manufacturing company is because you started your financial accounting by learning the transactions of a service company. And a service company is rather straightforward. Okay. You just provide the service and collect the money. So that's how you began your study in accounting. And then we looked at merchandising companies. Merchandising company bought in the goods that they turn around, put a price tag on, put a hanger on, and sold it. So now you see, from an accounting point of view, we had to deal with inventory. That means a sales could come back to us. We may return goods we bought. Customers return goods they bought from us. So we had to learn. And how did we account for inventory? FIFO, LIFO, or was it a perpetual type of inventory system? So you see, you began to learn more different concepts because of merchandising. Now, a manufacturing company is a company that takes in raw material and then converts that raw material into a finished product. That's what a manufacturing company does. So you see, and you will learn, we have three types of inventories. And we also have another type of financial statement related to the cost of manufacturing. So that's where we're going. But we begin with just understanding the manufacturing costs and the three categories of manufacturing costs. And today we will simply go as far as distinguish between what we call a period cost and what we call a product cost. Okay, are you with me? Now, before we really get into that cost concepts, I have to introduce something to you, which is the cost object. Now, in accounting, in management accounting, if we want to accumulate the costs of something, then we have to define what that something is. The cost object can be anything. Cost object is anything, as I said in my video, it could be a kilometer of highway, it could be a room at the Rotana. I want the cost of that. I want the cost to pave a highway, just a kilometer of it. I'm going to accumulate the costs. And to begin with, we must understand that some costs are directly associated with the cost object. And some costs are not directly associated, but are part of the cost object. So the first distinction you have to understand here is the difference between direct costs and indirect costs. Now, simply put, a direct cost is a cost that I can trace to the cost object and measure it exactly. I know exactly how much of that cost went into the cost object. An indirect cost is a cost that was necessary to produce my cost object, but I am unable to measure exactly. What do I mean by that? Well, let's just take, for example, an ordinary school desk. Wood, metal, plastic seat, that's about it. And I want to analyze the costs of that. Now, my cost object here is the desk. One desk. And I look at it and I say, okay, wood. Yeah, wood was used to manufacture the desk. I can see that. I can measure how much wood, and I know how much I paid for the wood. So I can come up with the cost of wood that went into my cost object. Let's say 50 dirhams. All right. So that is a direct cost. I see there's metal here, and I can measure exactly how much metal we used to produce this one desk, the cost object. And I can measure that, and I can get the cost of it. And so therefore the metal would be direct. The plastic seat, that too I can measure, would be direct. There's laminate that's laminated to the wood, and I use some glue to do that. Well, you see, glue was necessary to produce my desk, but I don't know how much. I can't measure. And so it's indirect. So I take every cost that went into manufacturing that desk, and I determine whether that cost is direct or indirect. A guy did the cutting. Okay, yeah, that would be direct. There's a supervisor, but I don't know how much of the supervisor's salary went into the production of the set. I don't know. The desk was made in a factory. The rent was part of the cost to produce the desk, but how much? I don't know. That's indirect. Electricity was used in this plant and also drove the equipment. So the electricity is necessary to produce my desk, but I can't measure how much electricity went into it. So you see what we're getting at. We're looking at costs of accumulating the cost for one object. Now, I can redefine this, and the cost object would be not just one desk, it may be 1,000 desks for Abu Dhabi University. And it takes over a month to do. Well, now you see the rent costs we pay monthly. All that rent cost is related to my cost object that it produced. The supervisor's salary for the month now is related to the cost object, because the cost object now is the cost to produce 1,000 desks, not just one. So you see, the definition of the cost object is very important when I'm going to say, look, I want to accumulate the costs, and I first of all want to determine which costs are direct and which costs are indirect. Assembly, that's all direct labor. And there are a lot of indirect costs, and we classify those indirect costs into what's called manufacturing overhead. So of the three categories, two of them are direct, which means I can measure exactly. I can trace it and I can measure it. One category, and it's the biggest category of them all, is the manufacturing overhead. All right. You see there's metal and there's plastic. Of course, there are screws in there, there is glue, there are little rubber tips and things like that. But this is the desk that I'm talking about here. Now, I'm a manufacturer of all kinds of desks, but I'm just looking at this one. And I'm going to look at the first category of costs, which is direct materials. Now, we call these direct materials raw materials. We call them raw because they haven't been converted yet. They're in their natural state. And that is wood, and there be long strips of metal that haven't been formed yet, and there'll be plastic that hasn't been formed yet. Okay. These are the basic materials that will go into my cost object, which is this one desk. Now, some of the raw materials are direct. That is, they can be physically and directly associated with the finished product. Okay, during the manufacturing process. So you can see that some of this plastic, I can measure how much, would be direct. The wood would be direct. The metal would be direct. But there are also indirect material like glue and maybe nuts and bolts and screws, or packaging, not part of the final product, but not also a significant part of the final product, a very small part of the total cost. So I don't bother including them in direct materials. They are considered to be indirect. I'm not even going to bother to measure how much glue or measure the costs of the nuts and bolts that go into it. So we consider those costs, indirect material, as costs is labor. Now again, there are two types of labor on the factory floor. One is the direct labor, and that is the work of the factory employee that can be physically and directly associated with converting raw material into finished goods. So if the person who cut this wood, I would know how long it take them to do it. I know what we pay, so I could come up with the direct labor cost to do that. The person who assembled all this, the person who bent that metal, all of these employees worked on converting the wood and the metal and the plastic into a finished product. And they would be considered direct labor. They worked on my product. But there are also indirect employees who are necessary to produce this product, but did not work on it directly. In this factory floor, there's a supervisor supervising all the employees. Now, the amount of the supervisor's salary that went into this desk, I can't measure that. There are AC costs for the whole factory. I don't know how much AC cost is related to this desk. There is the rent for the factory. There's the insurance. There's the forklift guy who moves his product from one place to another. All of these people were necessary to produce the desk, but I can't measure how much. I'm sorry, the labor went into it. I should be talking labor, not overhead. Okay? So the indirect labor would be the supervisor, the forklift guy, and the guy that cleans the factory floor every night. He's necessary. He's part of producing that product. All right, we go to our third cost category, manufacturing overhead. Now, in this cost category is all the indirect costs to produce the product. Included here is indirect material, indirect labor, rent, insurance, depreciation on the equipment, the electricity. All of these costs are necessary to produce my product, but I have no way of measuring how much of each one of those costs is consumed in the production of my desk. So costs that are indirectly associated with manufacturing the finished product. All right, that indirect is the key here. It includes all manufacturing costs except direct materials and direct labor. All right, now we're going to use the word manufacturing overhead. Other textbooks would say factory overhead or indirect manufacturing costs. The British call it burden costs. But what we mean by all those terms are those costs associated with manufacturing my product. I can trace those costs. I know they were necessary to produce my product, but I have no idea how to measure how much was used up in the production of my cost object. That's manufacturing overhead. Costs that are indirectly associated with manufacturing. Example, indirect material, indirect labor, depreciation on factory buildings, factory equipment, insurance on the factory, taxes paid on the factory, property taxes, maintenance that was carried out inside the factory, and on factory facilities, okay? Basically, manufacturing overhead includes all manufacturing costs except direct material and direct labor costs and period costs. Now, in a manufacturing company, we have two categories of costs. Of course, there are product costs. That includes all the costs that went into manufacturing my product. And of course, those costs are classified as either direct material, they're classified not as either, but they are direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. These costs are an integral part of producing my product. See, the important thing here is these costs are consumed to produce my product. My product is finished goods inventory. So these are not costs like in financial accounting, which were expenses, rent expense and salary expense and so like that. These costs are the costs consumed to produce my inventory. My inventory being finished goods. So these costs are also called inventoriable costs. When I finish producing my desk, that desk is an asset. It's not an expense. It does not become an expense until I sell the desk. And once I sell the desk, it then becomes the cost of goods sold, just like in a merchandise company. But you see, all the costs that went into producing that desk are cost of my inventory. So keep that in mind. They are an asset. These costs are not expenses. As I produce them, they're an asset for the company, and that asset being finished goods inventory. They do become an expense once I sell. So product costs are the cost to produce the product. Now, to run a business, of course, we have a president and a secretary. We have the marketing department. We have IT. We have HR. All of those costs are necessary to run the business, but they had nothing to do with manufacturing my product. And I want to determine, because I'm going to sell that desk that I produce, I want to be able to determine how much I paid for that, or how much it cost me to produce that desk. Because I'm going to set a selling price greater than the cost for me to produce that desk and to cover the costs of the marketing and IT and HR and to give a profit to the shareholders. So you see, we don't want to mix period costs, marketing costs or advertising costs, into the cost of the product. We want to get the true cost to produce my desk. So period costs are costs that will be charged as an expense in the income statement during the accounting period. These costs are referred to as non-manufacturing. For our purposes, we basically say they're selling costs, which includes advertising, marketing, sales, salaries, commissions, and administrative expenses, which includes the finance department, if you will, accounts receivable and that, and the marketing people, the HR people, the IT people. Those people are necessary to run the business, but not part of the product. So it's very important to distinguish. When we look at the costs of a company, a manufacturing company, all costs can be classified as either product costs or period costs. Product costs, of course, are direct material, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead, which includes indirect materials, indirect labor, and other indirect costs, and period costs. Now, period costs are the selling and admin. You see on the income statement, when I sold the product, my desk, it comes out as the cost of goods sold. And then I have my selling expenses and my administration expenses. But you see, this is the income statement. This is expensed. Now, if I didn't sell my desk, it's finished goods inventory and it's on the balance sheet. Now, to give you a better or clearer idea, I know it's not really well done, but it's the best I could do. I wanted to take the roof off a typical manufacturing company. I assume that many people have not visited a manufacturing company, a plant. So I'm going to take you on a visit. As you can see on the right-hand side, there's the front door. We go through the front door. And when you go through the front door of any manufacturing company, what you will see are the goods that they produce. The products are on display here. They want to show the world what they produce. And there will be offices up here, and those offices will have the marketing people in there, the salesmen. And they will all be in the front office. And the president of the company would be in the front office. And the secretary. Okay, all these people in the front office have nothing to do with manufacturing, but they run the business. And they basically could be categorized as selling and administration expenses, which you see on the financial income statement. Now, I didn't draw the door here, but let's assume there's a door. And you move into the factory area. This is called the factory area. Now, it may look very confusing to you because there's machines all over the place and you can't really follow what's going on. There's a lot of activity and a lot of people working at these different machines. But basically, every manufacturing company has the following kind of configuration. Somewhere near the back of the company will be a receiving dock. That's where the trucks pull up and drop off 4x8 sheets of wood, and lots of steel, lots of plastic, raw material for production. And there will be a storekeeper there, an inventory manager, who will have a card for every piece of material that's in there. And that's raw material. Okay. Now somebody is going to begin work on producing my desk. So they go and they get some wood and they get some metal and they take it to a cutting machine, take the wood to the cutting machine. They might take the metal to a drilling machine. They begin the work on the raw materials. So you see, this is no longer raw material. The wood and the metal and the plastic are no longer raw material because we're beginning to convert. You understand? Convert, change it from raw material to a finished desk. And we do that by drilling it, by gluing it, by cutting it, by bending the metal, and so on. And these parts then would go into another area, which is the assembly area. And here the employees will take the wood and the metal that's already been bent and the plastic seat that's already been produced over in this area and put them all together. Okay. Now, while they're working on that, again, this is inventory. This here is raw material inventory. But when the material is being converted, what we're doing is we're adding direct labor and indirect labor and manufacturing overhead to convert that raw material to a finished desk. So here we have a second category of inventory, and it's called work in process. It's not raw material because I've added labor and overhead. And it's not a finished product because it's not finished. Then, once it's finished, it moves into the finished goods storage area. And here we know the cost to produce that desk. in cost accounting, you will learn how, if you go on in accounting, how we accumulate the costs, the direct material, direct labor, and overhead in producing that desk. But nevertheless, for our purposes, now the desk is in finished goods, and we have a record as to how much it cost us to produce that desk. All of that on the factory floor are product costs. Costs necessary to produce my product. Direct material, of course, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. The insurance I pay for this part of the building, the rent I pay for this part of the building, the taxes I pay for this part of the building. This up here are period costs. Now the rent the part of the building, the rent for this part of the building is an expense. The insurance for this part of the building is an expense. So I determine how big this building is. Let's say 20% is front office, 80% is manufacturing. Well, then 80% of the rent would be manufacturing, 20% would be expensed as a rent expense. Okay, so you see, in management accounting, we must distinguish between the product costs because we want to get the true cost to produce my product. We do not want to include costs that were not necessary to produce my product, such as HR costs or IT costs or financing